Friends, today we are going to talk about liberalism in international relations. Earlier we talked about realism and neorealism in international relations. Liberalism is supposed to be the permanent party of opposition, if you look at IR theory broadly, because the most dominant and the most acceptable theoretical framework is realism. So liberalism has always competed with realism, but it has always come second best. So that's the reason why it is called as the permanent party in opposition. Firstly, we try to understand that what is the essence of liberalism. Actually, it is the tradition of optimism, because when we were talking about realism, you all through realized that we were talking about a theory which was very pessimistic, which had a very negative opinion about human nature in realism, and then about the structure of international politics, which they called as anarchic in neorealism. But here, liberalism comes as a breath of fresh air. It is the tradition of optimism. It talks about self restraint, that countries should be restrained on their own when they are acting on the international arena. It talks about moderation. It talks about compromise as a very viable option in international politics. And it eventually talks about peace. Stanley Hoffman, who was one of the most prominent exponents of this idea, talked about these ideals in detail, that is self-restraint, moderation, compromise, and peace. For this theory of liberalism, liberty of individual is of central concern. Now, you saw in realism, the primary concern was the state. Individuals had to do everything for the state, for the survival of the state, because the state was of ultimate importance. Here, the liberal theory argues that the liberty of the individual is of central concern, and states or any other institutions, they are created basically and primarily for the individual. So the primary focus is on the individual and on the liberty of the individual. And therefore, this theory argues that at the domestic level, whatever institutions and structures are created, and even at the international level, all the institutions and structures which are created have to be seen through the prism of liberty of the individual. So if they are promoting that liberty of the individual, they are doing justice to the reasons for the establishment or institutionalization. So therefore, a state comes out to be the servant of the collective will of individuals. From the 18th century onwards, liberalism has been a very influential theory in international politics. In the interwar years, that is between the First and the Second World War, it again gained ground because people were very rather dissatisfied or very frustrated with the kind of destruction and violence which was wreaked on the world by the First World War. And therefore, the argument ran that war was unnecessary. If you go into the historical background, we find that even in the 17th century, actually in the year 1693 to be precise, William Penn advocated the idea of a Diet or Parliament of Europe. This idea, if you look at it in its entirety, you would find it to be the precursor, or it carried the blueprint of the European Economic Community or the European Union of today, which actualized in the 20th century. However, the whole tradition of liberalism has seen varying interpretations and varying ways of looking at the tradition of human nature at the causes of war, at the importance or the centrality of the individual and international institutions in their usefulness for promoting progress at the international level. And because of these disagreements, we have decided today to group these rather traditions of thinking into three categories of liberal thought. So, for your convenience, we would talk here about the three strands of liberal thought. The first strand is known as liberal internationalism. Now, the very term internationalism connotes that we are talking about some kind of cooperation at the international level. A very prominent thinker, Immanuel Kant, talked about the lawless state of sovereignty, and he then talked about the idea of perpetual peace, which he had rather brought to print in the end of the 15th century. So he basically argued that we need to transform the consciousness of individuals. And he also talked about republican constitutionalism and the idea or the possibility or the usefulness of a federal contract among countries to abolish war. So he was talking about a future situation where we could be living in perpetual peace, where wars would be abolished, they would be something of the past, and all human beings would be living in peace and harmony. Then we had the prominent thinker Jeremy Bentham, who argued that between the interests of countries or nations, there is actually no real conflict. Means he was trying to argue that states or countries of the world have basically primarily no real conflict between and among them. But what actually happens that we have been conditioned over time to think in a certain manner. The influence of the theory of realism is so overpowering on our minds that whenever we look at the international system, we assume that conflict is inevitable. And since we are all thinking in terms of conflict, we are all thinking in terms of the remote possibility of cooperation. Conflict actually happens, wars do happen. So Bentham calls upon us to think from a different perspective, and he says that and emphasizes that between the interests of nations there is no real conflict. And he says that what we need to do is we need to subject states to a set of legal rights and duties. An idea, which is talking about legal obligations and duties even at the international level, something which was later on institutionalized, was brought into conception by Hugo Grotius, who is supposed to be the father of international law. Then Richard Cobden, he talked about the progress of freedom, and he said that the progress or the advancement of the cause of freedom depends upon the maintenance of peace. So what is essential in international politics is to maintain peace. And for maintaining peace, what we need to do is that we need to spread commerce. Means when countries of the world will trade with each other, the more they trade with each other, the more linkages develop among countries of the world, the possibility of conflict would recede, even further. And then he also talked about the diffusion of education. We need to be educated about international relations, the usefulness of international relations, the usefulness of cooperation, the usefulness of how countries, can progress if they interact with each other at the level of peace and cooperation. And therefore, Cobden actually advanced the idea that countries in the world should be aiming at progress of the idea of freedom. Later on, other than the liberal internationalists, we have another group of scholars in the liberal tradition whom we call as the idealists. This school of thought prospered basically between the early 1900s to 1930s. And these people were basically motivated by a desire to end war. And their central concern was, of course, because they had seen the devastation of the First World War, so their concern was to create an international organization to contribute to peaceful change. They thought that we need some kind of international organization which could bring together countries and which could create a situation whereby countries could meet short of war, meaning thereby that otherwise, if there is no international organization, many a time countries go and meet only on the battlefield because they don't want to talk to each other. Countries also have egos like human beings, Why should I talk to X? X thinks that why should I wish B? Because I am no less than B. So even if there is some very small issue of disagreement between us, and maybe it is imaginary, we are not even talking. And sometimes, that misunderstanding or disagreement could lead to a serious conflict between both of us. Similarly, for countries also, there could be small issues, small disagreements, some misunderstandings, some miscommunication, but that could eventually lead to war. We have had instances of many serious wars in the past in history where when after the war we went to the causes, we found that there were some very small trivial issues which eventually led to a war and something even bigger. So therefore, these people realize that if we have an international organization which can provide a platform on which countries of the world can come and meet and discuss and try to sort out their disagreements short of war. So at least they would get an option to try to resolve their differences before going to war. Of course, war would not be ruled out eventually, but it should not be the first option for countries. Rather, it should be the last option. The other thing they argued was that arms or the buildup of arms and weapons is something which is very dangerous, because once countries would have weapons and arms, they would eventually go to war. So what is desirable is disarmament. So basically, these people are talking about creating a situation where war becomes distant. Means countries should have cooperation, they should have deliberation, discussion, they should go for peaceful means of resolution of disputes, they should go for disarmament, and therefore peace would eventually come to the international political arena. Then these people argued that capitalism was inherently not peaceful. The liberal internationalists were talking about cooperation among countries, and they were even talked about the positive effects of capitalism, because when countries will come together, they will trade, they will have linkages, and that would lead to peace in the world. Here, the idealists are talking about capitalism from a very negative perspective, and they are arguing that what happened, when capitalism grew, it turned into imperialism, it turned into the desire of capitalist countries to go for more and more colonies. They went and colonized the other countries of the world, fought with each other, and eventually, the disputes and disagreements went too far and went to eventually lead the world to a world war. And in between, there were so many wars which were fought between colonial powers for possessing more and more colonies. And that was all the consequence of capitalism. Capitalism as an operational ideology at the global level. So they are arguing that capitalism inherently is not something which is peaceful, and there are rather elements of conflict which are rooted within the basic idea of capitalist growth. And therefore, they say that peace is something which is not natural. It is not something which will come automatically. In this world, you need to work for everything. So, if you want peace in the world, you want to work for that. You need to work for that. It is not something which will come automatically to the world. So, we as countries of the world need to work for peace. We need to make efforts for peace. And that is something, which was the motivation behind Woodrow Wilson's idea, 14 points, which led eventually to the creation of the League of Nations. It is a different matter that eventually America did not join the League of Nations, and the League of Nations eventually floundered. But taking lessons from the reasons of the failure of the League of Nations, countries of the world, after the conclusion of the Second World War, were able to come together and create another international organization by the name of the United Nations, which despite all its weaknesses is still surviving at the international arena, and it has many achievements to its credit as far as the establishment and promotion of peace at the international level is concerned. The third strand of thought within the liberal category is known as liberal institutionalism. The liberal institutionalists are talking about basically, of course, institutions, and they are trying to argue that these institutions create conditions for cooperation and peace at the international level. A prominent scholar, David Mitrani, talks about integration among countries. So, when more and more integration would come among countries of the world, that integration, that linkage in terms of trade, in terms of commerce, in terms of many other things, when countries would integrate with each other, that would have consequences, which he calls as ramifications, positive ramifications of the integration process, which will make war difficult, which will make war distant. Because when the integration will happen among countries, they would find, or they would see with their own eyes, the benefits of cooperation. And they would realize that if they were to go to war, this integration and the benefits of integration would vanish. And therefore, it would be difficult for countries to go to war once they go for integration amongst and between themselves. Then there is the argument which was basically advanced by Haas, that we need national and regional institutions, because if we create these institutions at the regional level also, then what will happen, that the economies of countries will get so interlinked, intertwined, that for them to get out of it would be very disastrous economically and politically, and they would not like to get out, because if they come closer, they would be seeing the benefits of that integration and closeness and cooperation. And as a consequence of these ideas, we saw on the European continent, the creation in the beginning, in the early 50s, of the European Coal and Steel Community. So when the European Coal and Steel Community came into being, as a result of this kind of a thinking of some statesmen on the European continent, many people were very skeptical that how could countries like Germany and France, which were on two sides in the World War, can even think of cooperating at the level of trade, in terms of production of coal and steel in their respective countries for their mutual benefit. But once that idea was brought on the table and countries realized the importance of that idea, they used that idea and they practiced it, and they started getting benefits of it. And you saw that eventually from the European Coal and Steel Community, the European community went on progressing, and today it is such a model for the whole world of cooperation among countries, and all the countries there are beneficiaries of being members of that wonderful regional organization by the name of EU. And then finally, the liberal institutionalists talked about the phenomena of transnationalism and interdependence. They are talking about thinking in terms of of interest beyond one's national interest. So you need to think beyond the nation. Your thinking has to be transnational. And when you are transnational in your thinking, that would lead to interdependence or interlinkage among countries. And therefore, that would lead to a situation whereby countries could be the beneficiaries of this kind of a worldview or thinking. Very prominent scholars like Cohen and Nye are talking about pluralism, and they talk about the centrality of other actors other than states, like interest groups, like international institutions, like transnational corporations, who are all very important actors on the international arena. So what liberal institutionalists are doing, that they are also shifting the focus away from state being the primary and the lone actor in the international political arena. Their argument is that there are other actors who are equally important and sometimes even more important than the states, and they can play a very important role in bringing countries together and creating peace in the world. And there are these other actors like interest groups and TNCs and international regional organizations and many other groups like whom you call as NGOs and international NGOs and so on, who can play a very important role in promoting cooperation and peace within countries and at the international level as well. So therefore, friends, today in this session, we talked about the three important strands of liberal thought. One was liberal internationalism, the other one was idealism, and third one was liberal institutionalism. In the next section, we will talk about neoliberalism. And in neoliberalism, we will talk about the parallels of these three strands in the neoliberal tradition to understand that how they are an advance upon these three strands of liberal thought which we discussed today. Thank you.